My name's Joanna Gilmour. I'm a curator at the National Portrait Gallery of Australia in Canberra. I'm also doing a PhD part-time at the Australian National University, and with the help of the Terra Foundation, I'm in the United States researching an exhibition on, a comparative exhibition I suppose, on Australian and American portraiture in the period before 1850. This painting by Erastus Salisbury Field from the Terra's collection is one that I saw on exhibition at the Art Gallery of New South Wales in Sydney in 2013, and it really sort of brought home to me the way that our two portrait traditions in both countries are really in harmony, but no one has ever really thought to kind of connect the two traditions before. So this painting by Field, believed to be of a woman named Clarissa Gallond Cook, painted in the late 1830s, 1838-39, which is when Field was at his sort of high point as a portrait painter, really kind of encapsulates for me a number of the sort of characteristics of American portrait painting at that time, but equally really resonates very strongly with certain artists who are working in places like Sydney and Hobart. He was a man from rural Massachusetts, and many of his portrait subjects came from the same sort of class that he was born into. The painting of Clarissa Gallond Cook, for example, is one of a number of portraits that he made of members of Clarissa's family in 1838 and 1839. So his social circumstances, as it were, his family circumstances, sort of created this sort of automatic set of clients, an automatic market, if you like. And he travelled around itinerantly, finding subjects where he could and painting portraits of them. It's even suggested by some scholars of Field's work that he had he'd have a stock of torsos ready painted, and his torsos, as you can see by this work, are characterised by this very sort of strong triangular kind of composition. And the theory goes that he had a lot of these sort of torsos ready to go and would sort of travel around just waiting to find the head and the face to add to them. On the one hand, the sort of poorly executed or ham-fisted execution of the anatomy, the shoulders in Clarissa's case, the hands, for example, the face not necessarily being a perfectly exact physiognomic representation of the subject. But Field makes up for that by focusing a lot of attention on what she's wearing, the beautiful lace collar on her frock, for example, the brooch that you can see, the rings on her fingers, the very sort of fashionable hairstyle that she's wearing. So he sort of paid attention to what he was capable of paying attention to. The sort of material culture, I suppose, that sort of defined Clarissa and his other sitters as members of the provincial gentry, people who'd achieved what they'd achieved through their own hard graft and not sort of by accident of birth, which of course was how it was for many British portrait subjects at this period. So it's a very sort of, I guess, Field's work you can read as a kind of a statement of truly American identity, independent American identity in this period. My research interest, I guess, very broadly is about the implications of the emergence of a middle class for portrait painting. More specifically, I'm interested in looking at the ways that Australia's and America's shared experiences as colonial societies, as settler societies, can be sort of tracked or mapped through the portraits being created in those places. One of the artists that I'm particularly interested in from the Australian side of things is a man named William Gould, he was a convict. He stole an overcoat in 1827 and for that reason found himself in Tasmania. There's a painting in the National Portrait Gallery's collection actually, which this painting by Field sort of really struck me, the similarities between the two artists, both painted in almost exactly the same year, 1838-39. The painting that I'm referring to in the National Portrait Gallery of Australia's collection is a portrait of a man named John Eason by William Bulow Gould, the convict artist. By the time he painted Eason's portrait, he'd achieved his freedom and was making something of a living by painting still lifes and also the occasional portrait and the occasional sort of piece of botanical natural history illustration, some of the works that he's better known for. The portrait shows Eason very much in his capacity as a shipwright. He was a man who arrived in Tasmania in the 1820s, right about the time that convict transportation to Tasmania is really ramping up, and also at the time that there were penal settlements on the west coast of Tasmania, where there was a great deal of shipbuilding going on, timber getting and shipbuilding going on. So Eason was the sort of man who was really capitalising on that industry and those conditions at the time. Gould is thought to have painted him in Hobart. The portrait shows him seated at a table, very much wearing or demonstrating, I suppose, the accoutrements of his profession. So it shows Eason as a professional man, the technical instruments that he has on the table before him, for example. But equally, it reminded me of the Field portrait in that Eason himself is not particularly well executed, shall we say. Some would say it's not a particularly good likeness at all. The hands, the shoulders, the way that Gould has rendered the arms, for example, not particularly sort of accurate or anatomically correct, but nevertheless, I think a painting which Gould certainly would have recognised as a great likeness of this particular subject, and which Eason himself would have understood and I think would have highly valued as a trophy, I suppose, a kind of a talisman, a document of the success that a relatively humble man from a relatively humble beginnings, I suppose, had managed to achieve in this sort of thriving provincial convict colony, irrespective of it being a colony at the end of the earth at that time, but a place where he, as I say, as a relatively sort of average guy, could make a very successful sort of living for himself. Interestingly, also with both Gould's portraits and also with this portrait of Clarissa Gallond Cook, is the way that as the artist has combined the kind of conventions of fashionable British portraiture with this very sort of local flavour of portraiture, if you will. So John Eason's portrait, for example, has the sort of typical drapery in the background, as does the portrait of Clarissa. The red drapery in the background with, of course, the classical sort of column as well, a very sort of typical trope or feature of fashionable British portraits at the time. But as I was saying, what the artist has done in both cases is sort of adapt their limited training or their limited skills and focused on what it was about these people, the possessions, the material culture, what it was about these people that these sitters would have understood to be signifiers of themselves and of their identity, and therefore what they would have recognised as truer likenesses, you know, straight up, no nonsense portraits, no flattery, warts and all. This is kind of how it is. And very interestingly, I think in this case, given that Clarissa married into a family that was involved in mercantile and sort of maritime trade, the background in Clarissa's portrait is incredibly telling, I think. It shows you an unidentified but a very specifically port scene, a port city with ships sort of plying the harbour, which I think is a very sort of strong signifier of not only her sort of position in society, but perhaps how she would have sort of understood herself and how she came to her position in society. I'm envisaging the show as I guess a timeline, really, a sort of a journey through Australian and American painting, starting from the 1780s and the 1790s, when the earliest Australian portraits are being made, and just, I guess, a show which really sort of shows the way that our traditions were in harmony in terms of portrait painting, which really sort of connects them, which really amplifies those harmonies, I suppose, and hopefully a show that not only surprises people about the connections that haven't been really explored very much before, but which gives Australian visitors and visitors to the Portrait Gallery a really fantastic introduction to this wonderful tradition of American painting that we see so rarely in the flesh at home.